Welcome to Hired in IT. Our mission is simple: help you build the skills that employers actually want. Whether you're trying to land your first IT job, switch careers, earn a promotion, or increase your salary, we're here to help. Every video is thoroughly researched and designed to make complex IT topics easy to understand. If there's an IT topic you'd like us to cover, leave a comment below. We may turn your suggestion into our next video. Turning IT knowledge into career opportunities. A security analyst writes this in a report. High risk. Hackers may attack the server. It sounds serious. But the infrastructure manager reading it has a simple question. What exactly needs to be fixed? Is the threat ransomware? Credential theft? An external attacker scanning an exposed service. Is the vulnerability missing MFA? An unpatched application? Excessive permissions? And what business impact are we actually worried about? Data exposure, downtime, financial loss, a regulatory consequence? If you can't separate threat, vulnerability, risk, and control, even a legitimate security concern can turn into a recommendation nobody knows how to act on. These aren't just certification vocabulary words. They're the language security analysts, engineers, auditors, GRC teams, and business leaders use to describe problems and make decisions. Use the terms precisely, and you can explain what could happen, why it could happen, what should be done about it, and what risk will remain afterward. That's what we're going to learn. By the end of this video, you won't just recognize 4 security definitions. You'll be able to take a real scenario and separate it into the threat, the vulnerability or weakness, the risk to the organization, and the controls that reduce that risk. You'll use a simple example to see how likelihood and impact can help an organization compare risks. You'll learn the difference between inherent risk and residual risk. You'll classify controls as administrative, technical, or physical. And you'll see how controls can serve preventive, detective, and corrective functions. Most importantly, you'll practice turning a vague statement like, "We have a high risk of hackers," into a structured risk statement that a technical team, auditor, or business leader can actually use. These are skills that show up in security interviews, audit preparation, GRC work, security engineering, and day-to-day IT decision-making. Picture a fake IT password reset email landing in an employee's inbox. It says, "Your password expires in 2 hours." The employee clicks the link, lands on a convincing fake login page, and enters their credentials. That one scenario can help us understand the language of risk. The threat actor is the attacker. The threat event or scenario is credential phishing. The attacker attempting to deceive someone into surrendering authentication information. Now look for the weaknesses that could make that attack more likely to succeed. Maybe multi-factor authentication, or MFA, is not enforced. MFA requires additional authentication beyond the password, making a stolen password alone less useful to an attacker. Maybe security awareness training is insufficient. Maybe email filtering doesn't identify the message. Maybe suspicious authentication behavior isn't being detected. Those are weaknesses or conditions that can contribute to the risk. Now ask what could happen to the organization. Stolen credentials could lead to unauthorized access, data exposure, fraud, service disruption, or further compromise. That's the risk scenario and its potential impact. Finally, we have controls. Phishing-resistant MFA, email filtering, security awareness training, suspicious login monitoring, conditional access policies, and an incident response process. Those safeguards can reduce the likelihood of the attack succeeding, reduce its impact, improve detection and response, or do several of those things together. And notice what we're not doing. We're not simply saying the employee is the vulnerability. Good security design assumes people can make mistakes or be deceived. The professional question is, what combination of people, process, and technology can reduce the likelihood and impact of that mistake? Use this mental model. A threat is a potential source of harm. A vulnerability is a weakness that a threat can exploit or that can otherwise contribute to harm. Risk is the potential impact and likelihood of that harmful event. Controls are safeguards that reduce the likelihood, the impact, or both. An incident occurs when an adverse event affects an asset, a system, an operation, or the people who depend on it. Controls may prevent that incident. They may detect it early, or they may limit the damage and help the organization recover. That distinction matters. An incident does not always mean every control failed. A control may work exactly as designed by detecting the event, alerting the right team, and keeping a small problem from becoming a major breach. When you can trace a scenario through threat, vulnerability, risk, control, and incident, you can explain a security problem in language that technical teams, auditors, and business leaders can all use. A threat is a potential source of harm. Sometimes it is an actor. Sometimes it is an event or condition. An adversarial threat could be an attacker trying to steal credentials. An accidental threat could be a person making an incorrect cloud configuration. A structural threat could be a disk failure or an aging system component. An environmental threat could be a flood, fire, power disruption, or severe weather event. The beginner mistake is calling every risk a threat. The threat is the person, event, condition, or circumstance that could cause harm. Risk is the potential adverse impact if that harm occurs, considered alongside the likelihood. A useful shortcut is this: the threat is the source of the danger. The vulnerability is the weakness. The risk is the potential consequence to the organization. Quick checkpoint. Imagine this scenario. An attacker sends a phishing email to an employee. MFA is not enabled on the employee's account. The employee enters their password into the fake login page. The attacker uses those credentials to access customer information. Let's separate the pieces. What is the threat? The attacker attempting credential theft through phishing. What is the vulnerability or weakness? One important weakness is that MFA is not enforced. Other weaknesses could include insufficient phishing defenses or inadequate awareness training. What is the potential impact? Unauthorized access to customer information. And what is one control that could reduce the risk? Phishing-resistant MFA would be one strong example. Email filtering, awareness training, suspicious login detection, and conditional access controls could also contribute. Notice the pattern: threat, weakness, potential impact, control. If you can separate those four pieces in a scenario, you're already moving beyond memorizing security definitions and beginning to think in risk terms. Risk is the potential for harm when a threat affects an asset or exploits a vulnerability. Consider a customer database protected only by a password. If an attacker successfully phishes that password, the organization could face unauthorized access, fraud, service disruption, regulatory consequences, legal costs, and reputational damage. That is why leaders care about risk. They are not deciding whether attackers exist. They are deciding which potential losses the organization is willing to live with, which ones need more controls, and where limited security resources should go first. A common way to express risk is to consider likelihood and impact. If a harmful event is more likely, or if its impact would be more severe, it deserves more attention. But remember, the calculation method belongs to the organization. Some teams use a simple 1 to 5 matrix. Others use qualitative levels such as low, medium, and high. Mature programs may use several methods depending on the decision. The important skill is explaining why a risk matters and what should happen next. Let's make the idea tangible with a sample 1 to 5 risk matrix. For a customer database, imagine likelihood is 4 and impact is 5. In this example, 4 times 5 gives a score of 20. For a legacy payroll system, likelihood might be 3 and impact 4. The score is 12. For a public blog, likelihood might be 2 and impact 2. The score is 4. On this example chart, the organization has decided that scores of 12 and above need treatment before launch. Your organization may use different thresholds, different score ranges, or a different calculation entirely. The lesson is not that 12 is a universal security rule. The lesson is that a visible, consistent matrix helps an organization compare risks, prioritize work, and explain why one issue gets fixed before another. You can create a simple risk score example in 5 lines of Python. Set likelihood to 4. Set impact to 5. Multiply them and print the result. Then add a branch that checks the threshold in this example matrix. If the score is 12 or above, print treat before launch. Use a hash symbol for comments in Python, not double slashes, so the example runs as written. The important caveat is on screen. This is a learning exercise, not a universal risk engine. Real organizations define their own scales, thresholds, approval rules, and treatment requirements. Your script teaches the mechanics of one simple model so viewers can understand how a risk matrix works. Once you've identified a meaningful risk, the next question is, what can we do about it? That's where controls come in. A control is a safeguard designed to modify risk. Some controls reduce the likelihood that a harmful event will occur. Some reduce the potential impact. Some help detect the event sooner. And some help the organization recover. Consider our phishing example. MFA is a technical control. If an attacker steals a password, that password alone may no longer be enough to access the account. Security awareness training is an administrative control. It can help people recognize suspicious messages and understand how to report them. A locked server room is a physical control. It reduces unauthorized physical access to systems and equipment. The important question isn't simply, does a vulnerability exist? The better question is, does this weakness contribute to a risk that matters to the organization, and what control could reduce that risk? That's how you move from finding security problems to making security decisions. A common way to classify security controls is into 3 broad categories: administrative, technical, and physical. Administrative controls focus primarily on governance, policy, procedures, and people-related processes. Examples include security policies, awareness training, background screening processes, access review procedures, and incident response procedures. Technical controls are implemented or enforced through technology. Examples include firewalls, encryption, MFA, endpoint protection, access control systems, and security monitoring technologies. Physical controls protect facilities, equipment, and physical access. Examples include locked server rooms, badge readers, security cameras, barriers, and guards. For a beginner, use this mental model: governance, policy, procedure, and training. Think administrative: technology enforcing or supporting protection. Think technical: facility or tangible physical access protection. Think physical. But don't treat those shortcuts as universal laws. Different standards and organizations may classify individual controls somewhat differently. What matters professionally is that you understand what the control does, what risk it addresses, who owns it, and how you verify that it actually works. Quick check. In our sample 1 to 5 matrix, likelihood is 3 and impact is 4. What is the score? 3 times 4 is 12. In the example policy on screen, 12 or above requires treatment before launch. But do not memorize 12 as a universal cutoff. Another organization may define its score bands differently, use a different scale, or decide that different asset types need different thresholds. The skill is not memorizing a magic number. The skill is applying your organization's approved method consistently and explaining the result clearly. Here is the part almost everyone gets wrong. You cannot eliminate every risk. A beginner patches a server and says, "The risk is gone." A professional asks a better question: what risk remains after this control is in place? That remaining exposure is called residual risk. A patch may remove one vulnerability. MFA may make account takeover less likely. Backups may reduce the impact of ransomware. Segmentation may limit how far an attacker can move. But the organization may still face threats, new weaknesses, control failures, operational mistakes, or consequences that the control does not address. After treatment, the organization decides what to do with the residual risk. It may accept the risk, transfer part of the financial exposure, mitigate it further with additional controls, or avoid the activity that creates the risk. Assigned risk acceptance is not itself a technical control. It is an authorized decision that says, "We understand the remaining risk, and the right person has agreed to accept it under these conditions." One way to picture risk management is a repeating cycle rather than a one-time project. Figure out which assets matter. Assess which threats and vulnerabilities apply to each one. Treat the risk with controls. Then monitor the leftover risk because environments change, new vulnerabilities drop, and controls fail, and that sends you back to identify assets again. This kind of loop is what a GRC analyst lives inside every week. After assessing a risk, organizations usually choose one of 4 treatment approaches. They may accept the risk when it is within the organization's approved tolerance. Acceptance should be documented by the appropriate risk owner, not assumed because nobody objected. They may transfer some exposure through insurance, contractual terms, or a third party. Transfer can shift financial or contractual consequences, but it does not make operational, reputational, or oversight risk disappear. They may mitigate the risk by reducing likelihood, impact, or both. That might mean patching a vulnerability, adding MFA, strengthening monitoring, improving backup recovery, or changing a process. Or they may avoid the risk by stopping the risky activity, removing the system, or choosing a different design. None of these choices is automatically correct. The right treatment depends on the business objective, the remaining exposure, the available controls, the cost of action, and the organization's risk tolerance. Auditors often ask for the same pair: inherent risk and residual risk. Inherent risk is the level of risk before the relevant controls are considered. Residual risk is the level that remains after controls and treatment actions are applied. For example, a customer database might begin with likelihood 4 and impact 5 in the sample matrix, a score of 20. Now add MFA. That may reduce the likelihood of a password-only account takeover. Add tested backups and a recovery process. That may reduce the impact of a ransomware event. Add segmentation. That may reduce the scope of a compromise. The revised score depends on the organization's methodology and on what the controls actually change. Some controls primarily reduce likelihood. Some primarily reduce impact. Some can influence both. The key audit question is not, did we make risk disappear? It is, what risk remains, who owns it, and is the treatment decision documented and approved? Quick recall from cloud shared responsibility. In many cloud services, the customer is responsible for the data, identities, access policies, and configurations it controls. The provider is responsible for parts of the underlying cloud infrastructure. The exact split depends on the service, so always verify the current documentation. Now connect that to risk. A team or provider may operate a control, but the business risk still needs an owner. Control ownership and risk ownership are not always the same thing. For example, a cloud platform team might manage an identity tool. An application owner may be responsible for using that tool correctly. A business leader may be accountable for deciding whether the remaining risk is acceptable. The lesson is simple. Know who operates the control, who is responsible for the system, and who is authorized to accept the residual risk. Imagine an auditor asks, when did the organization first identify this risk? Nobody knows. Who owns it? Nobody knows. What treatment was approved? Nobody knows. When was the decision last reviewed? Again, nobody knows. That's exactly why organizations maintain risk registers. A risk register is a living record of risk decisions. It can document the scenario, the affected asset or business process, the relevant threat or condition, the vulnerabilities or weaknesses involved, the likelihood and impact assessment, existing controls, the proposed treatment, the risk owner, action owners, target dates, and the next review date. Think of the risk register as a decision record. It helps answer, what did we know? How serious did we believe the risk was? What did we decide to do? Who was responsible? And when should that decision be reviewed again? A good register also makes patterns visible. Repeated vulnerabilities, overdue treatments, risks without owners, controls that need testing, and old decisions that may no longer make sense because the environment changed. Risk doesn't disappear because nobody wrote it down. A good risk register makes important risk visible enough for the organization to manage it. Let's enter one risk register row the way a GRC intern or security analyst might. Start with a clear identifier, RZU1. Now write a specific risk description. Not phishing risk. Instead, a phishing attack could lead to unauthorized access to the customer support system because MFA is not enforced for all users. Now identify the affected asset or process. Customer support system. Identify the threat. Credential phishing. Identify the relevant vulnerability or weakness. MFA is not enforced for some accounts. Now apply the organization's approved assessment method. For this training example, we're using a fictional 1 to 5 matrix. Set likelihood to 4. Set impact to 5. 4 times 5 gives us a score of 20. In this fictional organization's sample policy, a score of 20 falls into its critical category. That classification is specific to this example. Your organization may use different bands, thresholds, terminology, or an entirely different methodology. Now assign the risk owner. For example, Customer Support Systems Owner. Choose a treatment, mitigate, record the proposed action, enforce MFA and review existing exceptions. Then assign an action owner, target date, and next review date. Now the risk has become something the organization can actually manage. We have a specific scenario, an assessment, a named owner, a treatment decision, an action, and a date to determine whether the risk has actually changed. That's the difference between saying we have a security problem and managing risk professionally. A risk register is an evidence trail, and the exact columns vary by organization, regulation, and risk method. A useful register typically includes a risk ID, a clear description, the affected asset or business process, the threat or source of harm, relevant vulnerabilities or conditions, likelihood and impact, the inherent risk assessment, existing controls, the residual risk assessment, the treatment decision, the risk owner, action owners, target dates, and the next review date. Not every organization uses exactly these labels. Some separate control owners from risk owners. Some use qualitative bands instead of numbers. Some document assumptions, legal obligations, dependencies, or control test results. The principle is what matters. The record should contain enough information for someone else to understand the scenario, see why it matters, identify who owns the decision, confirm what treatment is planned, and determine when it must be reviewed. Organizations also need a way to express how significant a risk is. Two broad approaches you will encounter are qualitative and quantitative analysis. Qualitative risk analysis commonly uses descriptive categories such as low, medium, high, and critical. This approach can be useful for routine prioritization, especially when precise numerical data isn't available. Quantitative analysis uses numerical estimates. Those numbers may include financial values, probabilities, frequencies, or other measurable estimates depending on the methodology. One traditional financial example uses annualized loss expectancy, or ALE. The basic formula is single loss expectancy times annual rate of occurrence, or SLE times ARO equals ALE. In plain English, estimate the loss associated with one event. Estimate how frequently that event may occur. Then use those estimates to discuss expected annual exposure. For example, if one event is estimated to cause $50,000 in loss and is expected to occur once every 5 years, the estimated annual rate is 0.2. 50,000 times 0.2 gives an ALE of $10,000. That doesn't mean the organization will literally lose exactly $10,000 every year. It's an estimate used to support decisions. And that's an important warning about quantitative risk analysis. Numbers can look precise even when the assumptions behind them aren't. Weak estimates produce weak results. Use the methodology that fits the decision, document your assumptions, and don't confuse mathematical precision with certainty. Two terms you'll hear in risk discussions are risk appetite and risk tolerance. Organizations and frameworks may define or apply these terms somewhat differently, so always use the definitions established by your organization. But here's a useful beginner mental model. Risk appetite describes the broad amount or type of risk an organization is willing to pursue or retain while achieving its objectives. Think of it as the overall philosophy. For example, we maintain a low appetite for risks that could expose customer information. Risk tolerance gets more specific. It can define the boundaries or acceptable variation around that risk. For example, no critical internet-facing vulnerability should remain unresolved beyond the organization's approved remediation window. The exact threshold is determined by the organization, not YouTube, not a universal cybersecurity rule, and not whatever number happens to appear in somebody else's risk matrix. So use this mental model. Appetite helps describe the organization's broad posture toward risk. Tolerance helps translate that posture into more specific boundaries or thresholds. The important part is knowing what your organization has approved, and when exceeding those boundaries requires action or escalation. Quick checkpoint. A risk is rated high. Is that qualitative or quantitative? Qualitative. Now, an organization estimates the financial impact and expected frequency of an event to support a risk decision. Qualitative or quantitative? Quantitative. Now, leadership says, we have a low appetite for risks that could expose regulated customer information. What are they describing? Risk appetite, the organization's broader posture toward that type of risk. Finally, the organization establishes a specific boundary that determines when remediation or escalation is required. That's an example of risk tolerance being translated into an operational threshold. Remember, qualitative commonly uses descriptive categories. Quantitative uses numerical estimates and may include financial values. Risk appetite describes the broader posture. Risk tolerance helps establish more specific boundaries. And always use your organization's approved definitions and methodology when making an actual risk decision. Here are 3 mistakes that make a risk report weak. First, using the word risk when you really mean threat. Instead of writing, the risk is hackers, write, the threat is an external attacker attempting credential theft. Second, writing high risk with no explanation. A stronger statement names the asset, threat, vulnerability, likelihood, impact, and the reason for the rating. Third, treating residual risk as 0 after a control is added. A better statement is, after MFA enforcement, the likelihood of password-only account takeover is reduced. The residual risk remains within the current tolerance, subject to quarterly review. Precision is not about sounding formal. It is about making sure a decision-maker understands what can happen, why it can happen, what is being done, and what risk still remains. You don't need to memorize every security framework. Instead, learn what type of problem each resource helps you solve. If you're researching security controls, 2 important resources are NIST SP 853 and the CIS controls. NIST SP 853 provides an extensive catalog of security and privacy controls commonly referenced in government and enterprise environments. The CIS controls provide a prioritized set of cybersecurity safeguards designed to help organizations improve their security posture. If you're studying information security management, you'll encounter ISO IEC 27001. It defines requirements for an information security management system, or ISMS. The official standard generally requires purchase, but introductory information and supporting material are available publicly. For application security risk, OWASP provides resources and risk rating guidance that can help you understand how application security issues may be evaluated. Always check the current OWASP documentation for the methodology you're using. If you want to practice maintaining a risk register, you can also explore open-source GRC and risk management platforms such as SimpleRisk. And when terminology becomes confusing, security glossaries, including NIST resources, can help you compare definitions. Here's the important lesson. Don't collect framework names. Learn their purpose. Controls? Look at control catalogs. Security management program? Look at management system standards and frameworks. Application risk? Look at application security guidance. Risk tracking? Use a risk register or GRC platform. Terminology? Check authoritative glossaries. Then verify which standards, frameworks, and definitions your own organization or auditor actually requires. We've classified controls by what they are. Now let's classify them by what they do. A common functional model includes preventive controls, detective controls, and corrective controls. Preventive controls are designed to reduce the likelihood of an unwanted event occurring. MFA can help prevent a stolen password from becoming a successful account takeover. A firewall rule can prevent unauthorized network traffic from reaching a protected service. Detective controls help identify that something suspicious or unwanted has happened or is happening. A SIEM alert may identify abnormal authentication activity. Endpoint security monitoring may detect suspicious behavior. A security camera can also serve a detective function in a physical environment. Corrective controls help remediate conditions or restore systems after an adverse event. Restoring data from a known good backup after a destructive incident is one example. Applying remediation after an incident has been contained is another. And here's an important point. A single security process may involve several control functions. Incident response, for example, isn't simply one corrective control. The broader incident response process can involve detection, analysis, containment, remediation, recovery, and lessons learned. So think about the function being performed. Prevent, detect, correct, or recover. Different controls can intervene at different points in the same risk scenario. Here is the difference between a vague security concern and a usable risk statement. A weak statement says, "We have a high risk of hackers." That does not identify the asset, the scenario, the vulnerability, the business impact, the owner, or the action that needs funding. A stronger statement says, an external attacker could gain unauthorized access to the customer support system through a phishing attack because MFA is not enforced for all users. This could expose customer information and disrupt support operations. The proposed treatment is to enforce MFA, remove unnecessary exceptions, and monitor suspicious sign-in activity. The stronger version separates the pieces. Threat, an external attacker. Vulnerability, missing MFA. Asset, the customer support system and its information. Impact, exposure of customer information and disrupted operations. Treatment, enforce MFA and improve monitoring. You do not need to invent a score to write a clear risk statement. Start by making the scenario specific enough that someone can decide what to fix and who should own the decision. Quick check. What's usually missing from a vague statement like, "We have a high risk of hackers"? It often doesn't name the vulnerability, the asset, or the impact, so nobody knows what to fix. A stronger statement separates threat, vulnerability, and impact. Now let's turn this into something you can practice. Choose an asset you personally own or create a completely fictional scenario. For example, your personal laptop, your home Wi-Fi network, or a fictional customer portal. Do not use confidential employer information, real credentials, sensitive internal network details, personal data, or vulnerabilities from systems you don't own or have permission to assess. Now write one risk scenario. Start with the asset. What are you protecting? Then identify a relevant threat. What could cause harm? Identify a vulnerability or condition. What weakness could contribute to the scenario? Describe the potential impact. What could happen if the scenario occurs? Now identify an existing control and one additional control that could reduce the risk. Finally, apply a clearly labeled sample scoring method or use a qualitative rating and explain your reasoning. Your goal isn't to produce a perfect enterprise risk assessment. Your goal is to demonstrate that you can turn a vague security concern into a structured, explainable risk scenario. Keep that scenario. We're going to use it again at the end of the video to build your first risk register. Now turn that score into a decision. Your likelihood times impact gives a number, not a policy. On a 1 to 5 scale, 20 signals high urgency and 4 signals low. But the exact cutoffs between low, medium, high, and critical are defined by your organization's policy, not by a universal standard. Always check your own severity matrix before you commit to a band. Here is the payoff. A customer database begins with a concerning risk level because an attacker can target users with phishing, some accounts are missing MFA, and the organization has limited visibility into suspicious logins. Now add controls. Enforce MFA to reduce the likelihood that a stolen password becomes account takeover. Patch known software weaknesses to remove or reduce specific vulnerabilities. Add monitoring so suspicious login behavior is detected sooner. Add tested backups and recovery procedures to reduce the impact of a disruptive event. Add segmentation to reduce how far an attacker can move if one account is compromised. Each control addresses part of the scenario. Some reduce likelihood. Some reduce impact. Some improve detection and response. Together, they can lower the residual risk to a level the organization is prepared to accept. Controls do not delete attackers from the internet. They make successful attacks less likely, less damaging, easier to detect, and easier to recover from. Quick recall. After you apply controls, what do we call the risk that remains? Residual risk. And what happens next? The organization still needs a decision. It may accept the residual risk if it falls within approved boundaries. It may transfer some of the exposure through mechanisms such as insurance or contractual arrangements. It may mitigate the risk further by adding or improving controls. Or it may avoid the risk by stopping the activity, removing the system, or choosing a different approach. Remember the 4 treatment options: accept, transfer, mitigate, avoid. And none of them automatically makes the risk 0. The professional question is, what risk remains, who owns that risk, and has the appropriate person approved what happens next? Here is the whole video in 3 interview-ready ideas. First, a threat is a potential source of harm. A vulnerability is a weakness or condition that can contribute to harm. And risk is the potential impact and likelihood of an adverse event. Second, controls can reduce likelihood, impact, or both. They may be administrative, technical, or physical, and they can be preventive, detective, or corrective. Third, after controls, residual risk remains. The organization decides whether to accept it, transfer some exposure, mitigate it further, or avoid the activity creating the risk. If you can explain those 3 ideas with a concrete example, you are not just repeating vocabulary. You are showing that you understand how security decisions are made. Now take the risk scenario you created earlier and turn it into your first small risk register. Open a blank spreadsheet. Create these column headers: risk ID, description, asset or process, threat, vulnerability or condition, inherent risk, existing controls, residual risk, treatment, risk owner, action owner, target date. Next review date. Your first row is the scenario you already created. Now add 2 more scenarios using assets you personally own or completely fictional examples. You might use a personal laptop, a home Wi-Fi router, and a fictional online store. For each one, write a specific risk statement. Identify the threat. Identify the relevant vulnerability or condition. Describe the potential impact. Document existing controls. Then estimate inherent and residual risk using a clearly labeled sample method. Choose a treatment. Accept, transfer, mitigate, or avoid. Assign fictional owners where appropriate and give each action a target date and review date. Again, don't include confidential employer details, credentials, internal IP addresses, personal information, or real vulnerabilities from systems you don't own or have authorization to assess. When you're finished, you'll have 3 structured risk scenarios inside a simple risk register. That's a small project, but it demonstrates several real skills: risk identification, risk writing, control analysis, risk treatment, ownership, and documentation. Most importantly, be prepared to explain every row. Why did you choose that likelihood? Why did you choose that impact? Which control changes the risk? What residual risk remains? And why did you choose that treatment? That's what turns a spreadsheet into portfolio evidence. You aren't just showing an interviewer that you know what a risk register is. You're showing that you understand how to use one. Next up, networking for cybersecurity professionals, because you can't secure traffic you don't understand. Remember, careers aren't built by watching videos. They're built by applying what you learn. Pick one thing from today's lesson, build it, document it, and share it. That's how you get hired. Thanks for watching Hired in IT, where we're turning IT knowledge into career opportunities.